On the buzz meter this Sunday, as President Obama defends his airstrikes against ISIS, an anti-war contingent is emerging in the media, wary of being drawn into another Mideast conflict, worrying that the terrorist threat is being oversold.
Let me start tonight with what's on all of our minds right now, this wild, angry push for war. Another one in the land of Islam. Here we go again, going in with all the field marshals of the op-ed pages urging us on.
Others pushing for more aggressive action, saying Obama's plan can't work with air power alone.
The president knows that, but he's afraid to tell the American people the truth. Sooner or later, U.S. ground forces will have to engage ISIS.
Are the anti-war commentators acting out of ideology, or, given our bloody history in Iraq, are they actually sparking a healthy media debate? Some pundits on a crusade against the NFL in the wake of the Ray Rice fiasco, and now the belated benching of more players, and Commissioner Roger Goodell telling the press he's sorry.
What exactly does zero tolerance mean to the NFL? Will the NFL, in all its power, take the lead on the issue of domestic violence?
If any of these victims had been someone you love, would you be satisfied with the way the league has handled this crisis?
I'm not satisfied with the way we've handled it from the get-go. I made a mistake.
And are the media putting a whole league on trial for the transgressions of a few? Plus some lousy reviews for the new lineup at The View.
Let me ask you about, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, you can say it without laughing.
Sarah Palin.
When did you want to just pop up? Okay.
Ken Rosie and former Bush aide Nicole Wallace and the gang make this work. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The media debate over ISIS took a new turn after Joint Chief Chairman Martin Dempsey told Congress that if President Obama's strategy fails, he would recommend the use of ground troops against ISIS. Some pundits pounced on the contrast with the president, others calling the whole thing overblown.
In other words, the commander-in-chief is blatantly handcuffing those military leaders and is jeopardizing this mission in its entirety.
Can I just point out for a second how ridiculous the Beltway press is when they report on stuff like this? That is not a scandal. Because we have this notable and important thing in this country in which the guys in uniforms, no matter how many medals and stars and fancy hats and all those things that they have, they do not get to decide whether or how the United States conducts a war.
And more voices in the media challenging the war strategy or flat out opposing it.
Let's just be totally clear. We are committing to a military conflict in Iraq and Syria that may involve U.S. troops on the ground and already involves a few. But just like you can't be half pregnant, there's no such thing as a little bit of war.
Joining us now, James Rosen, Chief Washington Correspondent for Fox News. Mary Catherine Ham, Editor-at-Large of Hot Air and a Fox News contributor. And Mara Liasson of National Public Radio, also a Fox News contributor. James Rosen, what do you make of the volume of anti-war voices emerging in the media right now?
The question, Howie, that is properly raised here is whether the voices that are presently emitting some kind of anti-war sentiment in response to this fairly circumscribed military operation the President has announced are the kind of voices from which, with respect to almost any military operation, we should expect to hear a hearty hoo-ah. You know, we're talking about Rachel Maddow, for example, who in the clip you just played, I think displayed a kind of innate and unyielding hostility to the military.
How so?
With her references to medals and stars and fancy hats. I mean, I think that was really condescending. Chris Matthews, if only for his adulation of John F. Kennedy, might be considered a tad more hawkish than the likes of Rachel Maddow or Dennis Kucinich or Bill Maher, but I also think that we ought to consider that some of what we are seeing as anti-war sentiment right now, in some cases may actually just be an expression of displeasure with the sort of disjointed way in which this administration has defined and addressed this threat.
What strikes me, Mary Catherine, is the fact that many of these people, and there are others we could have shown, are basically on the left and ordinarily would be supporters of Barack Obama.
Well, sure. I think they're torn because ideologically they're maybe not in favor of jumping in the Middle East once again. And I think there is a bit of reflection in the press of a war weariness in general with the American public, though getting slightly more hawkish as we see the horrors of ISIS. And then I think it is also a reflection of the fact that the press is reporting on contradictions because there are major contradictions in how the administration has rolled this out, how they explain it, and where they draw lines. And I think that's actually something we should be discussing.
Right. And when it comes to conservatives, I mean, many of them actually favor the direction in which President Obama is moving, that is, toward military action. But they're still piling on the criticism. It's not enough. He's not aggressive enough. He should have done this sooner.
Yeah, and as one Republican in Congress said something like, we like the way the strategy is going, but if it doesn't go bad, we can blame him, or if it goes fine, we can say, what took you so long? So, I mean, that's the Republicans are in a sweet spot on that.
Having it both ways.
Yeah, yeah. But the thing that is also happening this week, one of the kind of threads was saying, aha, you said there were not going to be any boots on the ground, but there already are. Dempsey said maybe they'll need more, and I think the question is, we have a public opinion right now that is for this. The war-weary public flipped when they saw the beheadings on the airstrikes.
Also flipped in part because of the heavy media coverage of the ISIS threat, which some people think is overstated, some people think is even understated.
It's hard to miss those things on YouTube. The media didn't have to cover them. They're there everywhere.
Right.
You know, but I do think that the media is holding the White House to what it calls a high semantic standard. You know, you say there's not going to be a combat mission. What exactly does that mean? There are at least almost 2,000 advisors there now. They're going to be armed. They're going to have boots on. They're going to be on the ground, and they might be accompanying Iraqi forces up to the front lines at some point. Does that mean they're engaged in combat? But the bigger question is, at what point does it become too much of that for the American public to support?
Right. I want to come back a little later to the semantic question, but as our resident historian, James, how would you compare the media opposition to this war with the outright skepticism that the press showed and being very, I'm sorry, the outright skepticism is now, but the passivity that the press showed 11 years ago during the run-up to the Iraq War?
I think that there's a lot of mythology about the pre-war period a little over a decade ago during the Bush-Cheney administration. One of those myths is this idea that the press was, in fact, passive at the time in questioning the White House and the war aims in Iraq. I was in that briefing room during the first Bush term in the White House James Brady briefing room alongside people like Terry Moran and David Gregory and the other White House correspondents at that time. And I can say from firsthand experience that the questions being put to Ari Fleischer at that time were very probing about the WMD situation in Iraq, the war aims, the occupation that was to ensue. I think if you go back and you look at those transcripts of briefings, you'll see a very engaged press.
That might have been true within the briefing room, but if you look at the overall tone of the coverage, and I wrote a lengthy story about how in the Washington Post, a few voices that were skeptical of the strategy that wouldn't be a cakewalk, those stories were delayed, they were buried, in some cases they were spiked. But maybe that should tell us, and you were starting to touch on this, Mary Catherine, that this debate now is healthy.
Well, and I think, myth or not, I think there is some reaction of the press corps to that standing narrative about the Iraq War. Right.
The press feels it didn't do its job in 2003.
And I do think also when a president, as commander-in-chief, and we have this line where we, leave politics at the water's edge, that the press is more likely to be a bit more dutiful when that president is making an argument clearly and being very strong about it, and the American people are moving with him. In this case, I think you're not seeing that clarity and the strength of the message in the same way maybe you saw it with Iraq. And then I think a year ago in Syria, there did feel like it was the press almost pushing for this action at that time as well, and that felt like a reflection of that same
Right. This time around, it seemed like the drumbeat was coming from the media and the president a reluctant warrior, to put it diplomatically. But 2002, 2003, there was the sense that if you opposed what was a very strong drive for war by George W. Bush and his administration, that you were almost unpatriotic. And I don't see that now.
Yeah, no, I think things changed. Look, having Americans beheaded on camera is really powerful, and it really changed things. I don't think the president would be doing this without the kind of support he's getting from the public. Don't forget, 1 year ago, he almost struck the Syrian government. It was for a different reason. It was because Assad was using chemical weapons, and he didn't because the public was against it, and he would have lost a vote in Congress.
You took the words out of my mouth.
That's one thing that the strategy seems to be dictated by what the American people will allow, and there's some merit to that, but...
Because it's hard to fight a war without public support.
Right, but there is a sense, I think, from the press that, like, when there's not this pitch that is clear and strong, that there are more questions. And that's what's going on.
I actually disagree with that. I think the president has talked a lot about this. He's been out there talking a lot about this. Now, there are
He's talking a lot, but I think the strategy comes from public opinion as opposed to a strategy to win. I think that's the sense.
Well, yeah, although I think that the reason they changed is the public wasn't clamoring for this. The public is merely supporting it.
Well, some in the media, I think, have at least been pushing for it, and certainly on the commentating side. Let's come back to this question of semantics, because you were somebody, and everybody saw the videotape, who pressed the State Department, why aren't course, using the word war. First they weren't, now they are, kind of, sort of. But also on this question of ground troops, there seems to be confusion in the media, or a debate in the media. Are ground troops impossible, unlikely, or inevitable?
Look, in any organization, Howie, where there's a kind of a pyramidal structure where one person sits at the top.
Let me write this down. Pyramidal structure. So yes. It looks something like this?
Yes, like a triangle on its base.
Yes.
And the president is that figure in this instance, in this administration.
Right.
That lack of coherence about this mission, in the terminology, in the war aims itself, sometimes down even to the geography where it's going to be carried out, that confusion emanates from the top. It is permeated from this leader down into the various constituent officers who are doing the talking.
Are the media right to focus on this apparent disconnect between the president and some of his generals and these retired generals who fill the airwaves about not ruling out ground troops? Because there's this drumbeat, and I've heard a lot on Fox, why isn't he listening to the generals?
Well, I think that is a question. How are they coming to these decisions? There's also a question of, I think people don't want to discount that there's anyone in danger. Like the idea that this political line of no boots on the ground means there's actually no people on the ground is not the fact. And we should not discount the fact that Americans are going to be in danger regardless of that. So I think that's some of what people are trying to understand.
But is the press correct to say, to suggest that somehow the president is not doing the right thing because he's not listening to his generals? I mean, after all, George W. Bush fired one of his generals, Eric Shinseki, who testified, well, Eric Shinseki was gone after saying there'd be hundreds of thousands of troops needed in Iraq, and even Lincoln changed generals.
Again, there's some reaction to the Bush years, I think, in what you're seeing about this coverage. But I think there's also a genuine question about where this strategy has come from, why it was formed, and was it formed because of public opinion or because of the generals?
I think it was formed because they realized that ISIS was a real threat. Their assessment of ISIS changed from the JV team to a group that was heavily armed, took tremendous territory, and had tremendous amounts of money and
let's finish up by having you weigh in on this question of, is it inherently suspect, should the media be raising all kinds of alarms, that the president may differ with what his generals are saying, because the military often wants more.
I think it's fine to raise it, but it's important to put it in historical context, because it has always happened, as you just pointed out. Throughout history, that has been the case. There have been differences between the president and his generals.
I'm sorry, we got to go, but can you repeat that?
I was saying, Maddow, while flippant, and I agree with you about the way she phrased that, is right that they have a right to differ and that the president can make that decision.
And let the record reflect, ladies and gentlemen, that Howard Kurtz just likened George W. Bush to Abraham Lincoln.
There were separate paragraphs, James. All right, send me a tweet about our show this hour, at Howard Kurtz. As you know, we always read the best ones at the end of the program. Ahead, are the media now trying to damage the National Football League over domestic violence? But when we come back, an extremely harsh Politico piece paints Debbie Wasserman Schultz as being in deep trouble as DNC chairman. Is the White House using the press to tarnish her?